Marshal, I have no desire to mislead you. I'm sure you realize that recovery is not a sure thing.
36 years after the first Earth Day, 44 years after Silent Spring, the planet is closer now to ecological meltdown than it has ever been. If what we want is to stop the destruction of the life of this planet, then what we have been doing has not been working. We will have to do something else.
When we stay focused on the question, what do? We don't ask the more basic questions about how did we get here? And if we don't ask those questions, I don't think we've got much chance of affecting the kind of radical change that we're going to have to affect if we're going to make it.
Well, I appreciate your being so frank with me, Dr. Swanson. I guess I don't have to tell you how I feel.
From my experience, talking about how we feel is exactly what we need to be doing, and we'll also need to question some assumptions. One assumption I question is the one that tells us that since scientists can help us understand the situation, they are automatically equipped to tell us how to solve it. But there are forces at work in the world that cannot be understood through a microscope. What are the forces that brought us to this point? And what are the forces that keep us stuck here? I went to speak with the people who are trying to answer these questions. I realized that I would have to step outside of the culture so that I could see it from a new perspective. Deep inside the tangle of problems that threatens the entire world, there rages a boundless blaze of cultural fire, the locomotive power for the cultural train we're all now riding. An engine not of steam or diesel, but of story and myth, habit and belief. An engine racing out of control. It's time to look more closely at the culture of empire. So how did we get into this mess?
Wow. That's a cosmic question.
Many analysts think it started about 10,000 years ago, when humans began to engage in a new and fundamentally unsustainable style of food production.
What we invented was something that I call totalitarian agriculture, which is predicated on the notion that it all belongs to us. We can kill off anything we don't want on the land, put a fence around the land, we can grow the food we want on the land, and nobody else can touch it.
That slippery slope that we're on right now, we started walking on that 10,000 years ago. And it is because of an inherent problem in agriculture. Agriculture really depends on disturbance. There's no way you can do agriculture without doing that catastrophic damage. So it makes agriculture fundamentally unsustainable.
The surplus from this new way of getting food had immediate effects.
It has fueled this tremendous population growth of ours. Our growing population is always catching up with our food production. We have a food race on our hands.
We grow more food and the population increases. So we grow more food. It's a race that can't be won. On top of that, totalitarian agriculture also consigned its practitioners to a life of hard work and poor health.
As a species, we had food before us for all of our history, which is 200, 300,000 years. When you look at 10,000 years, it's relatively minor in that space. But we were hunter-gatherers. And so nature grew our food in its way as opposed to our way, which is agriculture. We didn't grow food, food grew.
Yeah, it's hard for people to accept the fact that the more you base your society on agriculture, the harder you work.
If we look at archaeological sites around the world, and people have done this, and all the locations, this is not a cultural issue, in all the locations where agriculture began in Asia, the Mideast, South America, and Central America, we will find people who are stunted, short, their teeth are invariably gone because of the carbohydrates they're eating turn into sugars and rot their teeth out. They're misshapen, they're asymmetrical, they show every evidence of suffering all sorts of disease,
This new type of agriculture both required and allowed more settlement, and with that came the beginnings of wealth and inequity.
If you go to pre-agricultural towns, you'll see a series of houses all about the same size. And almost instantly, when agriculture occurred, you can go to any town in any agricultural site in the world, not just in Western culture, and see a few very large houses with granaries connected to them and a whole series of smaller houses. That kind of social inequity began almost immediately with agriculture.
As Quinn and Manning point out, early agricultural peoples were not better off than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. This was news to me. The psychologist and cultural analyst Chellis Glendinning points to other consequences of settlement and agriculture.
Before, when women were moving around and very athletic and carrying their babies and having a diet that wasn't so high in carbohydrates and nursing their babies for long periods of time, then women did not feel like very often. But when women became sedentary, women began to have regular cycles. And so more babies were born. And so guess what? Then you have to make more farm. And then you have to expand the area that's fenced off. And then, oh, maybe you're going to meet up with someone else who's coming that way, you know, another group. And so then you have to have a war.
We're taught to regard agriculture and settlement as the normal and natural way for humans to live. So it was a bit of a shock to learn how these basic cultural changes were the fundamental cause of so many of the problems that have dogged us through the centuries. Derek Jensen speaks to the end result of all of this cultural change.
I think one of the best lines I ever wrote was that forests precede us and deserts dog our heels. When I think of, or when you think of the plains and hillsides of Iraq as the first thing that you normally think of, cedar forests so thick the sunlight never touches the ground. I think for most of us that's not the case, but the first written myth of this culture is Gilgamesh cutting down those forests to make cities.
Cities. Settlements begat villages, which begat towns, which begat cities. Totalitarian and catastrophic agriculture, the accumulation of wealth and power, and increases in population all came together to give rise to a new form of human culture, the culture of cities, the culture of civilization, the culture of empire.
I realized as I was writing the newest book, Endgame, that I'd been bashing civilization for probably 10 years now, and I'd never defined it. I didn't know what I was talking about. And so I define it in that book as a way of life characterized by the growth of cities. I've defined a city as a collection of people living in numbers large enough to require the importation of resources.
A city could be defined almost as a human ecosystem that grossly exceeds the carrying capacity of its local environment.
As Jensen and Catton point out, because cities exceed the carrying capacity of their local environment, and because they require the importation of resources, then those who live in cities are locked into the inevitability of getting those resources from somewhere else, from somebody else, by whatever means is necessary. Often that means is trade, but trade requires transport, and transport requires energy, and energy has to come from somewhere, and it eventually runs out. And trade requires willing partners, but people do not always want to trade. When trade breaks down, and you need those resources, what remains is war. We now need oil to keep our cities going. Watch the bidding war rage from trade floors to battlefields. Watch the Pentagon Plan and the Patriots Act.